So this is indeed a joint project with Yaron Nili about this new phenomena that Justin just told you about, which is we're seeing more and more companies adding directors with specific types of expertise. We're having a company with the cyber director, with the DEI director, with the climate director. And here's what you have to say about this new and we think important phenomena. I'll start with the 1-minute Cliff Notes version. Okay, so the first thing that we try to do is just to provide some evidence beyond the anecdote. So we go over the proxy statements of all the S&P 500 over the last 6 years to document just how big the change has been. And we see indeed that companies are disclosing much more prominently their directors' skill sets, putting heavier emphasis on directors' expertise. And we're seeing beyond their disclosure that the companies are adding these directors with specific types of expertise. For example, we see a 20-fold increase in the number of cyber directors just over the last couple of years. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? This is the second part of the paper. It's a law review paper, so we have a normative element to it. And we try to assess the pros and cons of this change. It's intuitive to think about it, to think about board expertise as kind of an unalloyed good. What can be bad about adding new types of expertise to your boardroom? But we try to highlight, based on the literature on group decision making, and based mostly on interviews that we conducted with board nomination committee chairs and their research consultants, the several drawbacks of this trend. And the bottom line is that when you try to address first-order problems, such as pollution or user privacy or diversity and inclusion, when you try to address it by focusing on a specific trait by a specific individual, it's not necessarily productive. It's sometimes counterproductive. It may hurt the effectiveness of board discussions on other topics, and in some cases, under some conditions, it actually hurts the effectiveness of the boards on that specific topic. So if you're nominating a director who is a diversity expert or is a cyber expert, it wouldn't necessarily improve the company performance on diversity or cyber, may actually hurt it, okay? And this brings us to the third set of insights, which is, again, law review paper policy implications. What does it mean regarding the scope and type of legal intervention that is needed, if at all? What does it mean regarding how the judges right here in Delaware will assess director liability going forward? Would it change? And so on and so forth. So that's the paper in a nutshell. Now, before we fill in the details, let me give you some background, just a couple of minutes, but really, literally a couple of minutes, because we're having here an audience with specific expertise in this topic. So the starting point is that boards matter, okay, in advising and monitoring management. And the question is, when will boards be effective in their roles? When we, corporate legal scholars, approach this question, we usually focus on directors' incentives, meaning we usually count how many directors are independent, or we count whether the roles of the chairman and the CEO are separated or not, as we just heard, okay? But I think everybody in this room realizes that even a board full of independent directors will not necessarily be effective in monitoring and advising management. Because even if you're the most motivated director, you have to have some skills and experience in order to know what questions to ask or process certain answers or anticipate future problems that weren't there on the PowerPoint presentation that you just received. So expertise matters. It's not just incentives. And now the real question is, what types of expertise do we need on boardrooms? And in the past, we used to think about directors as kind of these former CEOs, generalists. Maybe we used to think of financial expertise, right? But the ESG movement that we've been hearing about and we will continue to hear about has been changing that as well. There are certain very recent papers documenting the increased responsibility and accountability of boards in ESG. Boards are incorporating ESG factors when they design executive pay. Boards are restructuring, rewriting the charters of their committees to allocate specific ESG responsibilities to specific committees. And what we add to that literature is that in the last couple of years, it has also started to affect board composition, meaning affect what individuals companies are selecting to be on their board to begin with. And we start the paper by documenting several vectors, several forces from the outside that push companies to add directors with specific types of expertise. The first conduit here is regulation. Like in 2022, the SEC proposes a new cybersecurity disclosure rules, which would have required companies to disclose whether they have cyber experts on their board or not. Second conduit, institutional investors. Whether the largest asset managers and their voting policies, we want more climate expertise on their board, like the voting rationales that we just heard about, or socially minded specific campaigns by activists, certain activists. A third conduit, which is, I think, the most counterintuitive, is litigation and derivative settlements, as in the case of Boeing following the 737 MAX debacle. So for those of you not steeped in corporate law, in the end of 2021, it became a huge corporate law case about directors' oversight duties. The scope of director oversight duties. It settled for the largest settlement ever in such cases, $240 million. But for our purposes here in this discussion, it's much more interesting to note that the settlement included a provision where Boeing committed to add a director with aviation expertise within the next year and 2 more directors with product safety expertise within the next 3 years. So I want to stress just how unique that is, because even for us, like corporate lawyers, when we think about settlements that include a commitment of the company to change its boards, it's usually about adding independence. You're going to have to add more independent directors. You're going to have to make sure that the audit committee is comprised just of independent directors or whatever. And now we're seeing a requirement as part of the settlement that the company will add specific types of expertise to their boards. And again, this makes it for us, this is the only legal paper here in this conference, right? This is a legal issue, okay? If we're seeing the regulator, the SEC, if we're seeing the courts, making all these decisions based on some assumptions on whether it would be good or bad to have specific types of expertise on the boards, it's on us as legal academics to try to understand what does it mean, what do companies actually do on the ground, whether it's good or not to add specific types of expertise, under what conditions is it good or not, and so on. And this is where our independent study comes in. Again, so we went through all the proxy statements of the all S&P 500 companies from 2016, 2022. And we also did a sample 100 companies from the S&P 600 just to check small cap versus large cap. And we sift through the disclosure to find out what they say about the director's skill sets and experience. Now, not to anticipate the future discussion too much, but at the beginning it was hard because there is no standard, there is no benchmark, there is no way for companies to disclose their director's skill sets. And so we had to sift through different components of the proxy statements. But as time, like in 2022, by then, most companies are already adopting what you see here, which is a skill matrix, where we have the individual directors as the columns and the specific skills as the rows. And for us, when building the data set, this is like a one-stop shop. So these are the kind of the interesting findings from that data set. First, maybe the clearest finding is that companies are disclosing much more heavily, putting much more emphasis on telling the public what are the types of expertise that they have on their boardroom. The best way to illustrate it is what I just told you, which is more and more companies are voluntarily adopting these image-based formats for disclosing directors' expertise, which makes it much more easy for investors, for academics, to decipher the types of expertise that we have on the board. Like the adoption of skill metrics jumped from 14% in 2016 to 66% in 2022, and it continued to jump through 2023 as well. Aside from disclosing more, we see that they're also adding more rows to the skill metrics in the sense of, if I would be a company that discloses the skill metrics in 2014, you would see me put on the skill metrics like finance, legal, marketing, leadership maybe. In 2024, I'm putting there climate, DEI, cyber, okay? So we're disclosing also these ESG types expertise. And aside from finding that companies are disclosing more, we're seeing that companies are also adding more directors with these specific types of expertise, as you can see from the graph here. Right, starting very low, jumping very quickly, especially most of the jump came over the last couple of years. We're seeing a 20-fold, 10-fold, 30-fold increase in the cyber director or diversity directors and so on. But it's precisely when we started collecting the data and we saw this jump, it gave us pause. We were skeptical a little bit because we know just how glacial board turnover can be. It's slow, right? So where if you look, for example, at cyber, we're jumping from 200 in 2019 to 723 in 2022. Where did all these experts director all of a sudden came from? Okay? So we did a deep dive to try to understand what's going on here. And we saw that there are several forces working together. Some of the change that we're documenting is not a change in expertise, it's a change in disclosure. In the sense that if I'm a veteran director and I was on the board in 2019, maybe I had cyber expertise already in 2019. But nobody in the company was thinking that it's important for investors to know whether someone on the board had the cyber expertise in 2019. They started disclosing cyber expertise only in 2022. And so in our data set, we will only see it then. So that's a limitation of our data set, right? Some of the jump is due to veteran directors acquiring these types of expertise. I'm a veteran director. I was on the board in 2019. I didn't have cyber expertise. But then sometimes, maybe in 2021, the company decided that they're sending us on a weekend, on a 2-day cyber training program or whatever, and now we're checking the cyber expertise box. And another part, a not insignificant part, is, of course, companies adding from the outside specific experts in cyber or DEI or climate or the other rubrics. Okay, so we then try to figure out a little bit more how much of it is due to changing in disclosure, how much of it is due to changes in expertise. And so we read through the bios, the biographies of all the 723 directors who are listed as cyber. And we saw that only the minority here are listing cyber as one of their core expertise in their bios. So what does it tell us? It tells us that for the majority who don't list cyber as part of their bios, they have some experience probably discussing cyber issues, but it's not part of their core strength. That's not what they're on their board. They're not cyber experts in the ordinary language sense of the word. So this brings us as lawyers, this is kind of the holy grail for us because there's a policy implication here. And the policy implication here is that the current state of director expertise disclosure is not ideal. There's no benchmark, there's no comparability between companies, there's no definition. The way that it works is that each company sends directors a certain form, check the box. You know, you're checking the box in 2020, you're checking just 2 boxes, and then you're seeing that your other fellow directors checked more boxes than you. So you don't want to be below average, so there's a ratcheting up effect of expertise. So this is something that you need to think about. And indeed, I think the fun part of the paper is that we have several examples of directors. We heard before about needing to look at the individual director level. We're having examples of directors who are serving on multiple boards. In one board, this director is an expert in cyber. In another, he is not, and so on and so forth. Okay, and finally, there are also some findings about the differences between large and small cap, but I'll skip over. In the interest of time, I'll just keep them for now. Okay, so I'll move kind of quickly to the advantages and disadvantages. Again, the advantages are intuitive. Right? We keep hearing about ESGs. Companies, and especially boards, are facing increased societal demands, increased scope of responsibilities. And so why not introduce more skills, more experience in these issues that are now on the agenda and that weren't on the agenda like 4 or 5 years ago? But what I wanted to do here is I wanted to highlight the more counterintuitive drawbacks, potential drawbacks of this trend. First and most basically, we have to understand that when there's a sudden uptick in the demand for directors with expertise in cyber or DEI or climate, it doesn't mean that the supply immediately increases to meet the demand. The pool of quality candidates to serve on boards of large companies who are also experts in climate change or cyber is very limited. Is more limited than you think, is more limited than I thought. Okay? And so when companies are pushed to add directors with that specific types of expertise, it could very well be that companies are compromising their director selection process or their director onboarding process. Right? They might select directors with less than ideal interpersonal skill, less than ideal understanding of the core business, overboarded or busy. We can sort it out later. And this could lead to problems at the most basic level. So even if you added someone with an expertise in climate, and that someone, she improved the quality of board discussions over climate issues, but you selected from a limited pool of candidates, it may reduce the effectiveness of board discussions on other issues. And in fact, it may reduce the effectiveness of board discussions on that specific issue. And that is because of something that I think most or almost all of our interviewees said to us in the interviews unprompted, independently. And they raised a concern that the psychologists call authority bias, which is once you put someone on the board who is considered to be the cyber expert or the diversity expert, then the other members all of a sudden kind of overly defer to their perception, to the positions of this perceived expert on the board. There's also the issue of board size, or whether boards grow beyond their optimal size, because we're seeing indications that companies, usually when they are pushed to add these specific expertise directors, they just add directors instead of replace all directors. So this could push boards beyond their optimal size. And again, we don't mean to say that we have kind of the magic number of what the optimal board size should be, but the reason that we're worried here is that that's not an organic reconfiguration, kind of a bottom-up, firm-by-firm reconfiguration that every firm chooses. Right? Many of these changes are kind of reactions to external pressures to add specific types of expertise, like from litigation, or from institutional investors, or from regulation. Right? Another drawback is that not so much in this conference, but in previous conferences, previous years, we've been hearing so much about the pushes to promote racial and gender diversity in boardrooms. And to the extent that you care about these efforts, you might be worried about this new trend because, again, the point about the limited pool of candidates. If the pool of candidates of directors who are also cyber experts is tilted, doesn't have a lot of individuals from underrepresented groups, the fact that you're going to this pool to add your new directors may hinder the efforts to promote these underrepresented groups in your boardroom. There's also the issue of board washing, kind of similar to what we've hearing before, which is to say, if companies are facing pressures to treat their workers better, to treat user privacy better, to treat the environment better, you can either change your actual behavior or you can change your appearances, and checking a box in a skill matrix is kind of an easy solution. And again, the reason that we're worried here, and I think this might be kind of general to all the drawbacks that I'm listing here, it's not like we're saying that adding specific types of expertise is necessarily bad. We're saying that it's a very firm-specific decision, and we have two reasons to worry. One reason is that it's usually a reaction to external pressure instead of organic reconfiguration. The second reason is that the director expertise disclosure is kind of a cheap talk environment, which is more open to manipulation. And we worry that the combination of these factors will make it so that the disadvantages of adding specific types of expertise may outweigh the advantages of adding specific types of expertise. And this is what brings us to the policy implications. First and most basically, this goes against what legal professors usually like to do, but maybe the implication is that there is no need for legal intervention in the types of expertise that companies have on their boardrooms, in the sense that it's very company specific. Not all additions of expertise are created equal. Some types of expertise add value under certain circumstances, but not in others. Okay? To the extent there is some sort of legal intervention, we think that it shouldn't be in the form of nudging companies to add specific traits, but rather making sure that the quality of director expertise disclosure is better, and we provide some concrete proposals to that effect in the paper. As for courts, I won't belabor it too much. I'm seeing a kind of a glazed look in the eyes of the finance people around here. As for courts, there are some lessons to what we're describing here, or kind of trying to predict how judges will evaluate these types of new expertise in the boardrooms. If there's a cyber attack, there's a director oversight duty case, it comes to the boards. Will they evaluate the liability of this director who's an expert differently than the other directors who are not experts? Whether they will evaluate the behavior of the board collectively or individually based on like separate directors and so on and so forth. Again, there's some discussions on that in the paper. And I guess that's that. I will now hand it over to someone who is much more expert than I am on this topic. Thanks, Bob.
That was great. I want to introduce Bob McCormick from PJT Camberview to be the discussant on this paper. And Bob is also a member of the Weinberg Center Advisory Board.
Thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone. So if you're wondering why I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, you can either chalk it up to my attempt to limit PowerPoint fatigue or my laziness. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm, I guess, maybe the specialty discussant because I don't have the tremendous academic credentials of you all, so please bear with me. I'm really excited about this paper, so how excited I was during Irene's presentation. So there's certain aspects of governance that, as a practitioner, I've been dealing with for the last 27 years or so when I had my first proxy season, which ages you like in dogs' lives, which is why I look so haggard. I thought this paper was really fascinating because it's an issue that is so current. I was at the CII conference and ICGN conference last week, and there was a panel on this very issue. In fact, there was a gentleman from MSCI showing a study that said that companies with specialty directors actually have less experienced boards with less expertise, basically dovetailing exactly with what Roy was finding out. And I think this is sort of become the latest issue for shareholders to look at. If independence is sort of the issue from 20 years ago, director expertise is the new board independence. We sort of resolved the independence issue, we resolved the busyness, the number of board seats, attendance, and now investors are looking really closely at board experience. And they've done this for a lot of reasons, and I think Roy's paper does an amazing job of explaining sort of the importance of boards, their role, and why regulators and courts and society rely on them so much. And I think one piece, maybe a theme through my comments, will be about the importance of investors, and maybe that's an undertapped area you could use as an additional aspect to focus on, because I think having been an investor and having seen how investors can be more timely in their reaction to trends, they're the ones who can really push companies in a certain direction and are really looking closely at these issues, have really driven board matrices. I mean, that was not a company-decided disclosure. That was really investors pushing for that. And if you look at the way activist investors, they really target companies, and they look at the directors with the least experience in that industry, and that's a big hook for them, particularly with the big index funds. I almost said passive funds, but they don't like being called passive because on governance and ESG, they're anything but passive. So I think if you look at how we've grown from independence, if you look at sort of description of board independence from 20 years ago, sounds like the beginning of a joke. You could say a priest, an architect, a grammar school principal, and actor walk into a boardroom. Well, that was a boardroom 20 years ago of a major public corporation. Now that fit every independent standard, but were they really independent from the CEO, whose daughter, by the way, was a student at the grammar school where that director was a principal. So now looking at board independence, it's the one area of corporate governance where companies have done way beyond that shareholders ever asked, right? Now we generally only have one insider on the board. And I find that curious. Maybe that's the subject of a different paper, sorry for the aside, but I just find it fascinating that it's one year investors aren't even asking for that, and companies have already gone much, much beyond that. A separate issue is independence from whom? Because you have often the CEOs serve at a lesser time frame than their directors. So are we saying independence from the directors, from the CEO, or from the company itself? So those are kind of other aspects that I think kind of piqued my curiosity when reading the paper. But I think some of my main takeaways and humbly suggestions for Roy is to add investor interest as another component of what you're looking at, particularly on the impact on shareholder returns or even stakeholder returns. A little less on the societal, because I think the investors are in the best position to evaluate boards. They're the ones who do this routinely at every annual meeting. They're constantly engaged with the companies, and they're positioned to push companies to say, all right, you have a great board matrix. Seems like everyone has managerial experience. Everyone has international experience. Do they study abroad in junior year? Or what was the actual experience they had? And I think that's where investors are trying to struggle with is, what is the actual experience that you're claiming you have? And I think while the judiciary reaction, which is important, it's probably only going to be implicated rarely when there's an actual court case, right? So their ability to sort of, in the rare situation where like the Boeing situation where they're promoting a certain director, that is going to happen as frequently as investors looking at directors every time there's an annual meeting. So I think having that investor perspective and just in mind with the paper may actually help the more practical implementation of some of these ideas and a recognition that investors themselves are struggling with, is a specialty director really what we need? Or is it, or we're better off having a generalist who has some experience but actually has a broader set of tools? And the SEC, you probably saw last week when their new rules on ESG disclosure decided against having an ESG expert, right? So I think this is an issue that's very timely and that shareholders themselves kind of struggle with as well as regulators. I think on the performance, I'd be very curious to see if companies with some specialist directors or specialist committee, as some shareholder proposals are actually pushing, how they perform. Do they outperform their peers? Do they underperform? Or is there no real impact? Because I think that'd be a strong indication for shareholders as to which way we go. Shareholders will definitely look at academic studies when they examine the right board structure, classified boards, poison pills. So data on this issue I think would be really helpful as well. And particularly on the impact of the matrices. Investors have been pushing for more information, and they always fall into the trap of be careful what you wish for. 94 pages for a report. Well, some of these proxy statements are 150 pages. The CD&A alone are 55 pages, right? So we're always asking for more data, but it's really what is the quality of the data? And I think that's where the board matrix can help. One thing I've learned over the years is companies actually have an internal board matrix, which is much more detailed and actually provides more information about skills gaps and what they need. Maybe that's something you can ask for, not to load up more work on your plate, but that could be an even fuller picture of what they're looking for and how they use that, and maybe what they really think about the board skills. You cited a couple great examples of companies that have, like DT and Fortive and Darden, that have adjusted some of how they basically rank, so to speak, or rate the expertise. Honeywell is another good example. They have basically 3 levels of expertise when they rate the board members. So they call it technical expertise, managerial expertise, and working knowledge, which allows directors to, if they have some experience, it's not a just yes and no. They can kind of, rate how deep their knowledge is. And I think that can be helpful if it's a bit more honest, frankly. And they also define what each of those means. So I won't go into those, but it helps investors understand, well, when they say managerial, what is the actual background for that? Some companies ask the directors just to list their top 3 skills. And it kind of forces them to put their best foot forward, so to speak. Certainly you may know from your talk to corporate secretaries, sometimes they feel an obligation to ensure that there's an equality either in, frankly, just length of bios or number of expertise checks, because you don't want 1 or 2 people who are real outliers. So it's not just the directors who may be ratcheting things up, it's also the corporate secretaries. So on the authority bias, I thought it was fascinating because I think that is a overstated concern. You have financial experts on boards, you have attorneys, you have accountants, you have people with marketing experience. One could say those are also potentially subject to authority bias. So I don't think that's as big a concern as some may. The board dynamics of adding a new director, what does that mean? You often see in a proxy contest, well, that's going to change the whole board collegiality, and the directors are all about board collegiality. And then you talk to directors and you're like, well, board collegiality is overdone. We want people to ask a difficult question who aren't going to agree on everything. So the concern about a specialty director negatively impacting that kind of board dynamics, I think, is also overstated. Maybe one aspect that you could delve into a little bit more is companies with robust director evaluation processes that show, do they do this internally, do they do this externally? A lot of companies I see do internally every year and then externally every 3 years. And it's interesting, almost every board survey says, you see, the director themselves say, well, I'm doing a good job, but then, 1/3 of the board isn't doing their job. So it's it can be an effective way to get to some of the very same issues. Is the board effective? Do we have the right experience? And do we need to fill any gaps? When you talk to corporate secretaries, they're almost constantly searching for new board members. It's actually ongoing process. And part of the challenge is finding the right individuals. And I'm maybe challenging you on one item of, if you're adding new specific directors, I think that presents an opportunity to potentially broaden the diversity, rather than, and I think one of the things I've seen from shareholders is let's push for board tenure or term limits, because it forces turnover, which then promotes the opportunity to actually appoint a new diverse director. Because if no one retires, then it's hard to increase the board diversity. And then one just last plug for ES versus ESG, that term has become such a third rail. And I think if you could tease out the G from the E and S, treat them differently, I think that could be helpful and maybe avoid, some aspects from certain people who maybe are really critical of the ESG term. Overall, great paper. Thank you.
So can I just two? Oh, okay. So just two quick thoughts on Bob before we open it up for discussion, and if we don't have enough discussion, I have many more thoughts. So one thing that you said about be careful what you wish for, this is something that we saw in the data. Yaron and I are actually thinking about a follow-up paper on that, and that's the ratcheting up effect of skill matrices, which is originally we adapted the skill metrics to make the information about director skill sets much more comprehensible to directors. And then the effects that you're seeing, you hear it from the directors themselves, the effect that you're seeing of the skill metrics is kind of almost like PERC disclosure or CEO disclosure, which is there's much more comparability now, and you don't want to be the director which is below average in the number of boxes that they check, and that creates an inflation in the number of boxes that people check, which makes the director expertise disclosure much less informative to investors. So that's one thing. On the authority bias, we shared your suspicion, and also we pushed back in interviews. And the way that it was explained to us, I think it's intuitive, but I would be interested to hear what you're seeing. Of course, there's always concern of authority bias, also not just among directors themselves, but from the officers, from the managers, and so on. The way that they told us that is that if I'm kind of thinking to myself, I'm an alpha director or whatever, and somebody's coming to me with financial expertise or marketing expertise, I have my strong opinions on that as well. But if there's an issue that I think, as a 70-year-old grumpy director, that I think is not that important. No, I am. In this example, as a grumpy director, I think that DEI is not that important. I think that climate change is not that important. But I know that it's now on my agenda, and now they're bringing someone who is the expert on that topic. I feel much more relaxed. I don't need to educate myself on this new topic that I don't know much about, that I don't feel comfortable with, and then it's much easier for me to defer on this topic that I don't like to begin with. Okay, so that's the issue on the authority bias. I think you're right about the follow-up. These are another follow-up papers. I think we actually closed the paper with calling on people to conduct these studies because most of these changes are just from the last couple of years. So we checked from 2016. Most of the jump is from the last couple of years. I mean, in our data set, 2021, 2022. And I think that now it's starting the time where you can do these studies where you try to link. You have a directors with companies with climate experts, directors on the board. Do they take advantage of green investment opportunities? Are they embroiled less in event-driven litigation over climate things and stuff like that? I'll do it.
First off, I think you sold yourself a little short when you said the finance people's eyes were glossing over. I think we were all more fascinated than you have any idea. That was amazing because you weren't showing us robustness test 8 and model extension 5. So this was fascinating.
You guys were the talking theory. I was the talking legal.
There you go.
Yeah.
I guess I have a question. You know, as we think about these expertise sets, they seem to augment the core ones like finance, law, you know, the ones you want typically.
Yeah.
Is there a concern in addition of just proliferation of what things we need expertise on? Like you've had DEI, ESG, and cyber. What about AI? And what about, you know, is there a risk that there's just too many skill sets that we are looking for expertise on?
Absolutely. This season, it's all about the AI expertise. And I think it also relates to one of the things that Bob said right toward the end, which is they behave differently than other types of expertise. It would be much easier for you to gauge or to define or to disclose whether the director has legal expertise or whether the director has financial expertise. Does it mean accounting or not? Accounting type financial expertise or non-accounting type financial expertise, and so on and so forth. And in that case, I was grouping here together for the sake of the presentation all these types, but they behave differently. cyber expertise, it's much easier for you to know and to break whether I have some experience discussing kind of managerial expertise, whether I have technical expertise in cyber or not. But companies are also disclosing general ESG expertise. What does it mean to be a general expert in ESG? Inclusion expertise. It doesn't behave the same way. It can't be couched the same way. It can't be measured in the same way. And I think the more these kind of things will happen, with the AI bias and so on and so forth, the more companies will go different routes, which is, okay, I'm going back to generalists. I'm having training sessions. I'm making sure that they are educated on AI, because all my directors need to be educated in some sort of a level on AI. And maybe if cyber is so important to our company, or AI is so important to our company, then I can bring in an outside advisor, maybe even just for the board. Maybe this will be just the board's advisor on cyber, or maybe just the board's advisor on AI, but instead of putting them inside the board, which making the board kind of bloated. Or I'll do some X-team model of the board. We'll have a core board, like 6 individuals or whatever, and then we'll have an X-team board, like 12 individuals who with some specific types of expertise. I imagine that changes like that will be coming in the next 5 years or so.
I think that does make a difference. I think that's a really good solution, because I'm concerned about the disclosures of the skill sets with the proliferation of potential fraud and other types of liability. We're talking about director liability if you're supposed to be the ESG expert on the board.
Oh, you're talking about like the securities law liability.
Yeah.
Which is the company is like disclosing something,
Yeah.
either inflating its capability or omitting something.
Absolutely.
Why didn't you catch it in time?
Oh,
So
exactly.
you the specific
exactly.
director,
that
is now
kind of
subject.
it's going to hit your D&O. And
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it could very well be. Actually, this is one area in Delaware law where there is surprisingly little guidance in corporate law literature. There's one case from like 20 years ago of Justice Jacobs in an M&A context, where he says that this one director, you had financial expertise, so you had to know that the controlling shareholder is stealing horses in the price. All the others, they are not liable, but you are subject to liability because you have this greater expertise. So yeah, another kind of.
It rarely happens, but I could see it potentially.
I agree. Going forward, I agree. I agree.
So it also could be empirical problem, but I'm just curious to know, because we assign expertise, do we also assign potential responsibilities? Suppose I'm appointed cybersecurity director on a board, and later my firm has a data breach. Would I become unmarketable afterwards while everybody else remain intact?
You're talking about kind of the labor market reputation.
Exactly.
Of
like without this designation, probably everybody assume one over-end responsibility, but because I'm the designated candidate,
so
it could be I assume 90% of responsibility. Do we observe such a trend in the director market?
So 2 quick thoughts on that from a legal perspective. The way that they assign responsibilities is to committees and subcommittees rather than to individuals. So there will be a committee that will be assigned like the responsibilities over cyber, and maybe the cyber expert director probably will sit on that committee. That's one thought. And the other thought is that if you're a director candidate who has cyber expertise, I wouldn't worry about your labor market opportunities for the next 20 years. You're all set, don't worry. Don't worry about it. You will be overboarded very quickly.
Investors will hold the committee members responsible. They'll look at the charter and they'll say, the governance committee failed to have enough diversity.
Yeah.
There was a restatement, so we'll look at the audit committee.
We have time for one more question.
It's rather a quick comment rather than the question. I think this is really useful discussion. So there is a paper written by a group of finance scholars, Michelle Laurie. Many of people here know about her. She's organizing the Drexel Corporate Governance Conference. And what they found is if companies disclose director skills in image-based forms, then that can help them gather investor support. So essentially when ISS recommend against the company's directors, they can more convincingly get the support from institutional investors.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that's the intended effect, or how do you view what they find there?
Yeah, we saw this working paper and we cited it several occasions in the paper. I think it's connected to something, again, something that we end the paper with, which kind of directions, where are we going here. There's also, from a legal perspective, kind of a universal proxy rule, which is it used to be that you either vote on a complete slate by the incumbents or a complete slate by the insurgents. And now that investors can vote on, can pick and choose specific directors, that also, increases by many folds the demand to know specific things about that specific directors and their specific skill sets. So I think it's also part of the reason why you are moving towards disclosing it in a much more comprehensible, digestible way for investors. And the stuff that Bob mentioned about we want to know more about the way that they evaluate internally, I think this will also be the thing that we'll start seeing going forward.
Okay, thanks. I think there are more discussions need to be done.
Tons of them. Thank you.
This session, we can go for
Thank
a
you.
short break.
Thanks a lot.